across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. The first hour, we're going to spend some time once again going back to the area of apologetics. How do we defend the Christian faith? And we're going to be looking at it in a very interesting way for this next hour that I think you're going to appreciate. Matter of fact, it's a delightful book, and I hope that you will take the time to find a little bit more on our website. We have given you quite a bit of information so that you can actually learn more about the particular topic we're addressing. We have information about that on the web links, Cold Case Christianity. We also have a video trailer that you can watch to give you a little more background. And the book that we're going to be talking about is called Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the Gospels, the claims of the Gospels. It is written by J. Warner Wallace, foreword by Lee Strobel. And for those of you, like I, that like to watch occasionally the CSI programs or the television show Elementary or Hawaii Five-0 or whatever it might be, you know how in many cases an investigator has to look at the facts and reconstruct the past. And likewise, whether you're a paleontologist trying to reconstruct the past from the bones and the stones, or whether you're an investigator trying to reconstruct a crime with the evidence that is there in the present time, likewise, we also have to do some of that when we look at the Gospels. And so I think you're going to find this book very interesting. Those of you, by the way, that are teaching young people, I think this would really engage them, and so I hope that you will stay with us, and a little bit later we'll give you a chance to ask some questions. J. Warner Wallace is the author of the book, but he also, of course, is a cold case homicide detective. He's also been a missions leader and a church planter, came to Christ later in life, and so was a skeptic, and this alone probably helped him understand how to take some of the things that he learned out in the field and in the courtroom and apply them to Christianity. He has been working with our good friends at Stand to Reason, and he joins us now by phone. So, Warner, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
So glad to be here, Kirby. Thanks for having me on.
I know some people call you Jim. Should I say Jim?
Yes,
or
please. Yeah, please do. I only use the J. Warner because, Greg Kokel over at Stand to Reason, one day he called me and said, Jim, it's time for you to change your name. And I said, really? Why? He said, well, because the Jim Wallace at Sojourners is going to be confused with you because your names are so similar. And I said, okay, I guess it's time to change. So,
all right, so we'll call you Jim. I wasn't sure, and I thought maybe that was the case.
Yeah.
But first of all, I'd love to have you share just a little bit of your testimony because it is relevant to the book, because really for the first 35 years of your life, you were pretty much an atheist.
Yeah, actually, I was. I'm pretty committed. I was very committed to my worldview. I was more than happy to engage the Christians in my life. I really found them to be, and maybe it's just my own setting, but here I was working as a police officer, working as a detective, surrounded by people who had a very high value for evidence, understood how evidence was assembled, and then when it came down to it, the few Christians in that setting that I would ask questions about their faith really did not have an evidential view about this one most important, aspect of their lives, the one set of questions that required, I thought, the most support. They did not take an evidential approach, even though they were very committed to the evidence in their professional life. And I found that to be really frustrating. As a matter of fact, I looked at that as just flat ridiculous. And that, for a long time, was one of the reasons why I held the Christians at arm's distance. I really felt like they just did not take a rational, evidential view about this important question.
So again, I think it really helps us understand the importance of evidence, not that evidence leads to conviction. I can show evidence to atheists that will say, well, that's just your view of reality, not my view of reality. But nevertheless, it does, I think, show the power for some to begin to question this. And you share in the book about at one point where you said to your wife, this might be true. And she probably rolled her eyes saying, oh, I've been down this road before with this guy. But nevertheless, you did come to saving faith. And then took all the skills that you've learned as a detective and began to apply them in this excellent book published by David C. Cook.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. That really was my journey. A lot of times you'll talk to people about what role evidence should play or ought to play or has played in their lives as believers, and there's no doubt I recognize the fact that God has to do something first in terms of I had a true volitional resistance to the idea of God that I thought, looking back at it, I know was far greater than my kind of rational, evidential misgivings about Christianity. I simply did not want there to be any other God than Jim. That God was big enough in my own life. I didn't need to have anybody else take his place. And so for me, a lot of it was number one, once God did remove that enmity that I had toward him, now I was able to kind of look at the evidence fairly, and I had never been in a position where I was excited or even motivated. I walked into a church at the age of 35, and the pastor there was at least able to communicate to me that this Jesus guy is smart. And, you might want to listen to what he has to say. He's got some time-tested, sage, wise advice. And so I began to look at the teaching of Jesus just as you would. I remember as a young man studying the teaching of Baha'u'llah. I remember studying, the ancient wisdom from Buddha. I was willing to look at time-tested wisdom. But the problem, of course, was I had to sift through the Gospels in order to get that out, to get the red letters out. And once you start doing that, I realized that, wow, these Gospels look a lot and a great number of similarities to some of the characteristics that I see in eyewitness accounts. And even before I got to the letters in which, John, or even into the Gospel of John, before I got to Peter's letter in which he claims to be an eyewitness, I had a sense that, wow, I needed to look a little bit deeper just because I was seeing some of the unintentional eyewitness reports that I typically saw when you've got two people describing the same event. And so that's what started my journey in looking at the Gospels as eyewitness accounts.
Well, whether you want to understand the Gospels or want to know how to defend your faith, or whether you just love some of the CSI-type programs or the detective types of programs, you're going to benefit quite a bit by all the principles that you have there about circumstantial evidence and certainly about corroboration and the rest. But let's kind of get into it. The first principle is don't be a know-it-all, and you take us to the first time you were at a crime scene, and you got kind of this grizzled man that has been there as a detective for many years, and when you see this woman that has obviously been murdered, he's assuming right off the bat that the husband did it. Turned out not to be the case, but he had let his presuppositions come to a conclusion that was not warranted by the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all have these guys in our lives, guys who, and especially in law enforcement organizations, there's a certain pecking order, and I was the bottom on the chain of the pecking order there in those days, and I remember just kind of deferring to his wisdom, and he walked in and saw a particular type that he thought was what he was looking at, and we chased all the evidence in that room under the presumption that the kind of suspect we were looking for would fit into the box that this detective had already decided he was in. And what it demonstrated for me is, man, you got to be careful, because not only were we wrong, we wasted several days thinking that this was a possible solution, only to discover finally, and really even it was I had to wrestle the idea out of his mind. He was really committed to this presupposition. Then, of course, he had egg on his face, and he wanted to make sure that he didn't want to look bad in front of all of us. So there are lots of reasons why you might hold on to a presupposition. But to be fair in any investigation, you've got to walk in with empty hands. You've got to walk in and lay down your presuppositions. I was a philosophical naturalist all my life. Grew up in the Star Trek generation. I really believed that science would have an answer for everything. They were all answers were going to be naturalistic, and I was so committed to philosophical naturalism that to ask the question, does God exist, something supernatural, I began with the presupposition that nothing supernatural exists, so therefore I had excluded that possibility before I ever began looking at evidence about this. And when you do that, you end up with where you started. You end up with the answer you started with. And I always would find a way, even if there was no answer, well, where does matter come from? How does life originate from non-life? These were questions that I had no answer for, but I was willing to hold on to my presupposition.
We'll take a break. Be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Jim Warner Wallace, and he is the author of the book Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. One of the points you were making there also about presuppositions applies in the courtroom. You don't want to have jurors say, well, this guy looks too nice. He's no way he could commit the crime, or somebody that maybe looks that way, he's obviously guilty, or after all, I wouldn't believe that somebody of my race would commit that kind of crime. And so you would certainly say that those are very bad presuppositions for jurors. Certainly we have bad presuppositions, as we just mentioned, for detectives. But, for people that are seeking truth, there are no miracles. There's nothing outside of the natural realm. Supernatural explanations cannot be allowed. Those are presuppositions that a lot of skeptics have, including you.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you'll find that most people who are committed to either scientism, a version of science or of a natural naturalistic worldview that really only accepts answers that can be derived from scientific processes, or will only accept naturalistic explanations. Even, for example, we see it with historians, people who look at history, and the moment they encounter some claim in an ancient text that something supernatural occurred, well, then, of course, they've got to recategorize it. That's no longer history. Now that's mythology. But these are presuppositions we hold against the possibility that anything outside the natural world exists. And I think if we're going to ask the question, isn't any search for the existence of God, anyone who's questioning that, looking at that question for the first time, is really asking the question, does something supernatural exist? And you can't begin a search for that answer if you begin with the presupposition that nothing supernatural can exist. You have to at least be fair enough to let the evidence take you where it leads. One of these inferences is going to be the most reasonable. But don't resist it just because it happens to be a supernatural explanation. That's the dilemma I think I faced as a non-believer, and that's where I see a lot of my friends are. Even now, they still reject anything that's supernatural. And that's a wrong-headed approach to this investigation, because, after all, that's the question that we're examining.
Again, Cold Case Christianity, about 280 pages, published by David C. Cook. We have the video trailer on our website, pointofview.net. We also have a link to Cold Case Christianity, so you can find it there. And of course, if you want to look for it in your local bookstore, please do so. We've also made it possible for you to purchase it on our bookstore as well, because we think very highly of the book. Let's, if we can, maybe talk about circumstantial evidence.
Okay.
And a great chapter there, because it's one thing to have an eyewitness to see someone who commits a crime, but the reality is that they might not have seen the person. The person, as you point out, the perp might have been wearing a mask. But if you have other things, which might be matching boots, spot clean pants, a dented bat that was bleached, a fictitious alibi, maybe the victim's house key, all of those circumstantial pieces of evidence can also lead to a conviction.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I tried to use examples from my own casework. I was careful to make changes. At the time I wrote the book, I was still very active in a number of cases. And the DA who I was working with said, Jim, come on. You cannot be literally using the cases we're working on right now. So I just took and kind of tweaked the details to kind of make the point. And what I tried to do is show how we typically assemble a circumstantial case that points to the most reasonable inference of a particular suspect. And we do it all the time. I've yet to have a case. I work in only cold cases. And in my cold cases, I haven't had the luxury of a witness who saw the suspect do something, or even a piece of forensic evidence that you might say is forensically sound, like a piece of DNA evidence. I just don't have the luxury of those kinds of cases. Instead, I build cases off dozens and dozens of pieces of circumstantial evidence that all are accounted for most reasonably by the same conclusion. And that's what we're looking at here. That we got to stop saying this expression, oh, that's just a circumstantial case. That drives me crazy, because that's all I ever have. And yes. I can guarantee for the people who are in custody right now for the rest of their lives, having done murders 30 years ago that we've now convicted them for, they would tell you that circumstantial evidence is powerful, because that's why they're in jail.
And you talk about the cumulative nature of circumstantial evidence, which you're just talking about. Right. But let's now apply this here. Nobody was there to see the origin of the universe, the origin of life. Whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, we can start there. But then you start saying, well, let's look at the causal evidence, the so-called cosmological argument. You have cause and effect. Let's look at the design, the so-called fine-tuning evidence. Let's look at the anthropic principle as well, and the design evidence, as well as then maybe the moral evidence, and a number of others. And you have this wonderful diagram where once you pull all of this together, you can say, no one was there to see whether God created the universe or whether the universe created itself. Think about that for just a minute, but we'll leave that on the shelf. And then look at all the kinds of evidence, the anthropic principle, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, all these big name words, but all the evidence that you bring in to show that circumstantial evidence can have a cumulative effect in understanding the origin of the universe and the existence of God, just as the cumulative evidence of those kinds of things have been able to convict people and put them in prison.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do kind of mention some of the arguments for God's existence, but the book is really not about providing those arguments. There are better places to go to get that. What I hope the book does is show how once you understand the arguments, these are then assembled together. I have to kind of briefly go over the arguments in order to assemble them into the package. But the point of cumulative circumstantial cases is that you make them on a variety of different kinds of lines of evidence that that all point to the same conclusion. So, for example, when we see evidence of fine-tuning in the universe, that's very different than an argument about that comes from the existence of transcendent moral codes, transcendent moral laws. These are two very different lines of thinking. One is you can make actual visual observations and scientific observations. One is really quite philosophical in nature. The point is you've got a number of different lines of evidence that are almost reasonably explained by the same singular conclusion of God's existence in this case. And so what happens with these kinds of cases is the defense attorney is going to come in and try to pick off any one of them. Oh, that one's no good. Well, there's the problem. The problem is not just the one. We're not just resting on the cosmological argument, for example. It's the depth of all the arguments that point to the same conclusion coming from very different disciplines that makes the case so powerful. You might have eyewitness testimony, you might have forensic evidence, different lines of evidence that point to the same suspect. Here we've got different kinds of arguments and different categories of evidence that point to the same conclusion about God, and that's why the case is powerful. It's exactly what we do in court every day, and it's powerful for jurors. And we have to help them understand the nature. We actually instruct jurors. The judge instructs jurors to tell them that circumstantial evidence is not to be considered with any less merit than direct evidence. As a matter of fact, it would be considered exactly the same in terms of their evidential power. And I actually sometimes trust circumstantial evidence even better because, let's face it, eyewitnesses can lie to you, and they can want to lie to you. But circumstantial evidence never tries to lie to you. You can misinterpret it, you can misinfer from it, but it never tries to trick you.
Well, and that brings us to the question about eyewitnesses, which is one of your other principles. Principle number 4, test your eyewitnesses. And it's important to recognize, as you point out in that section there, that certain eyewitnesses have better memories than others. Certainly, in various eyewitnesses are more able to observe more facts than others. People not only observe better, have better memories than others. So, again, it's absolutely crucial, especially as we now talk about the eyewitnesses to the gospel, that you test those witnesses and make sure that they're credible.
Yeah, we actually have a standard that we use, and we have 14 questions that we allow jurors to kind of ask themselves as they're examining eyewitnesses on the stand. And these are break down into 4 large categories that I try to examine in the second half of the book to see if the gospels pass that test. But we ask jurors, you don't accept an eyewitness as being truthful. You're allowed to judge that eyewitness, to test that eyewitness in your mind, to say, hey, is that eyewitness, are we sure he was even there? Is he lying to us about being there? Is he accurate over time? Has he changed his story? These are different criteria we use, and we would never want to accept someone's testimony blindly. There are at least 4 criteria that we examine eyewitnesses. And one thing I can tell you for sure, Kirby, I never had a problem as an atheist who was reading the Gospels for the first time with the apparent contradictions in the Gospels. That never bothered me. That was one area that I never stumbled over because I felt like, hey, I see this all the time in my casework. No 2 eyewitnesses have ever agreed on a singular event. Even when I'm sure, without a shadow of a doubt, they were both present, they still see the same event differently. It's my job to make sure I understand why. What is the perspective difference? Is it a physical perspective? Is it emotional? Is it historical? What is the difference between the eyewitnesses that causes them to see the same event in different ways? But they always do. So that never bothered me in looking at the Gospels and saying, well, there are some differences in the Gospels. Well, duh. By the way, one last crazy thing. You know, we in courts all the time will tell jurors that a witness can actually be wrong about a particular detail because they were blocked by somebody or they were too nervous to see it properly, whatever it may be, but still be considered reliable in their testimony. Now, that's an important principle. An eyewitness can be wrong about a detail, yet still deemed reliable by the jury. So what we do is we say, hey, if that's the case in criminal trials, now I don't believe that's the case in the Gospels, but can you imagine if that was the standard, well, then the Gospels pass with flying colors. So we really have to kind of be realistic about how we judge eyewitnesses. The bar we have in court is actually much lower.
Well, we're going to take a break, and we will continue our conversation today with Jim Warner Wallace. And if you would like to join our conversation along the way, we'll certainly open up the phones. But we're going to spend a fair amount of time continuing to work through his book. It is entitled Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. And it is published by David C. Cook. You can look for it in your local bookstore. Of course, we make it possible for you to order it from us. us if you would like. And we also have a link to the website if you want to get it there. We want to make sure that you know about the book. And I would also encourage you to watch the video. It's a video trailer that explains a little bit more about what's in the book. We'll be back with more right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Jim Warner Wallace. The book is entitled Cold Case Christianity, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the most important principles, certainly in criminal justice, but it's also important in terms of taking this idea of eyewitnesses, is the idea of the chain of custody. That actually you have a crime scene, then you have the crime scene investigators, and then you, of course, have the detectives all the way down to, in your case, a cold case detective. Some of our listeners might remember the O.J. Simpson trial, where the argument from the defense was that the Los Angeles police detective Mark Furman actually planted the glove. So that suggested a problem with the chain of custody. But that applies not only to a crime scene, and whether you had a lying detective or somebody who planted evidence, it comes back to the chain of custody, if you will, from the life of Jesus to the first written documents. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, actually, this is one of those areas that I think I did have skepticism about. And as a guy who was not a believer, I always assumed that, this guy Jesus might have been a nice guy, might have been a good teacher. As a matter of fact, that's why I was first interested in him. But I figured all later developments related to his deity, to his performing miracles, to rising from the dead, all of that stuff has to be a late insertion, a late addition over time, the kind of growing legend of Jesus. And that, again, comes down to, does somebody change the evidence along the way between the actual event of the crime and the courtroom 30 years later? Did somebody just throw a piece of evidence in the property box and now we're stuck with it? So did some believer in the 2nd or 3rd century add a detail to the Gospels and now we accept it as true when in fact it was never part of the original story? We've got to go back and take a look at, in our casework, at the crime scene and see, did anybody take a Polaroid? And then when they gave the evidence to the next person who processed it, was another picture taken of it? Was it signed in properly, signed out? Can we account for it all the way through the 30 years from the time of the crime to the actual trial? Well, the same thing we can do with the original documents of the gospel writers. Did the first person at the scene take a Polaroid, take a picture? I sometimes explain to my groups when I talk about this what a Polaroid is, because not everyone even knows what that is anymore. But this instant
digital photograph,
digital photograph, right? Did somebody pull their iPhone out and take a digital image?
Yes.
And of course, we think somebody did. His name was, let's say, for example, the Apostle John. But how do we know that that's really the image of Jesus we can trust? Well, does he give that piece of evidence to somebody else, to another officer, who right away takes another Polaroid, takes another digital image, so we can see, has the evidence changed? And then he gives it to another officer and takes a picture, and gives it to another officer and takes a picture. And we can see over time if the image is changing of that piece of evidence. Well, we can, because we can look at the Gospel of John and examine what it claims about Jesus. And then we can go to the very next set of pupils, the students of John, particularly in this case Ignatius and Polycarp, and we can ask ourselves, what did they say that John taught them? Well, they took a Polaroid of Jesus, and let's see what it looks like. Does it match John's, or is it very different than the gospel we have today? Is the Jesus that Ignatius and Polycarp learned from John a lot different than the Jesus we see today in John's present gospel? And then, of course, Polycarp and Ignatius had a student, Irenaeus. He took a picture of Jesus. Let's take a look at that. He had a student named Hippolytus. He took a picture, and we can go on and on down through history to see, is the picture of Jesus changing? Is the chain of custody intact? And do we know if the Jesus we have today is the same as we have all through history? As it turns out, I have an entire chapter. What I do is I try to list the characteristics of Jesus as mentioned by the second generation of officers, the pupils of Peter, Paul, John, all these early church fathers who not only took a snapshot of Jesus, but wrote letters of their own to the church in which they described what Jesus was according to what their instructors, the apostles, the eyewitnesses, what did they say about Jesus? And as we examine those documents, you'll find that the Jesus we know today is the same as it always has been. The entire life of Jesus, from his virgin birth to the resurrection, is recorded and repeated by the very next officer in the chain of custody. So we can be sure, if nothing else, that the Jesus that we know about today is not a late invention, it's not a growing legend over time. That's the earliest version of Jesus that we've ever known, and he's been there from the very beginning.
And I might just mention, again, you've got some wonderful diagrams in here so that if somebody was teaching this to a Sunday school class, and I think this would just, if you used your technique, would just be fascinating to a middle school or high school group, because they would just love that, not to mention adults who probably watch Cold Case and watch all sorts of CSI-type programs and the rest. But then, even more so, you take it as a, if you will, a chain of custody from the life of Jesus all the way to the Council of Laodicea. But then you come back and say, well, wait a minute, we really don't have to go back that far, because then you begin to give us very good evidence for the fact that virtually all of the New Testament was written before 70 A.D. Explain.
Yeah, that's the good question I think we have to ask is, how early, these are claiming to be eyewitness accounts, but if the skeptics are right, and these are written in the 2nd and 3rd century, right before the councils affirmed them, then there's no reason to believe we should trust any of them, because they don't pass the first test we would offer for eyewitnesses. Were you actually there at the scene when this occurred? And if they're written in the late 2nd, 3rd century, then forget it. They're not eyewitness accounts. They're written too late in history. So I had to know, first of all, how early were they? Do we have a good circumstantial case that we can build for the dating of the Gospels? And if we did that, where would it put us? Well, you've got missing elements in the book of Acts that I think are critical and unusually missing. Nowhere anywhere in the New Testament is to describe the destruction of the temple. We know that occurs around 70 A.D. Why would it be missing when in Matthew 23, Matthew's going to describe Jesus making a prophecy about the destruction of the temple? It would probably be smart to put that in there to at least confirm that Jesus is an accurate predictor of the future. But it's not anywhere in the New Testament. Neither is the siege 3 years before. Neither is the death of Paul. Think about this for a second. In the book of Acts, Luke records the life of the apostles, and 3 are most frequently mentioned: James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and Paul. Yet all of them are still alive at the end of the book of Acts, even though Luke has recorded the death of Stephen and the death of James, the brother of John. Why mention these 2 other characters dying in history, yet fail to mention how the 3 most important characters die? They're all still alive, because I think the most reasonable inference from that is that these events have not yet occurred. And when you're talking about events from 61 to 70, 61 the death of James, to 70 the temple destruction, and none of those are actually mentioned in the book of Acts. So I think it is fair to date that early, and I date it around 60, because that would at least cover the missing death of James, the brother of Jesus. So I think if you could look at this and say, well, is there any other evidence that corroborates that? I think there is. I think you've got internal evidence in the writings of Paul, in which he seems to be referencing Luke's gospel in 1 Timothy. He seems to be referencing Luke's gospel in 1 Corinthians. There are good reasons to believe that Luke's gospel, which is written before the book of Acts, is written very early. Remember, 1 Corinthians is written in 53 to 57 A.D. And, of course, what does Luke do in the first chapter? He tells Theophilus, I'm going to write for you a history of Jesus, an orderly account, he calls it. Well, why would he call it an orderly account? Well, I think one reason why he might be calling it that is because in the 1st century, Papias, the bishop, says that Mark was penning the work of Peter, the testimony of Peter about Jesus. Mark is recording it, being very careful about accuracy, but not so particular about order. That's interesting. Papias is saying that Mark's account is not really necessarily all that orderly. Well, Luke then says in his first chapter, he is going to write an orderly account, and who does he quote more than anyone else? He quotes Mark, the account that's not so orderly. It might explain why Luke is calling his account orderly. So what's interesting about this, I think, is that I think you get early dating on Mark. I put Mark in the late 40s, early 50s, and now we're within a dozen or 15 years of the actual event, and I think that puts us in the lives of the eyewitnesses.
Well, and again, that's the whole idea of this chain of custody, because you go back to 70 A.D., then you go back 3 years before the siege of the various events that take place there. We probably know that most people believe that Paul and Peter died A.D. 64 in the Neronian persecution, so you have to have Paul writing all of his books before that. Yep. He's quoting, as we said, we go further back then, as he is quoting as well from Luke, and we know Luke is quoting from Mark, and pretty soon Mark is writing right after the death of Jesus.
Yeah, and you wonder, well, why didn't they? I always ask this question. We're in an immediate culture, right? The young people I talk to are probably thinking, well, why didn't they just they should have been texting about this and Facebooking this right away. Why did they even wait 12 years? And I think a lot of this is because there seems to be a common thread through all the Scripture that these folks believed that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetime. And they were waiting for the imminent return of Jesus. And I suspect, at least in the first couple of years, there wasn't much of a sense that we need a document that's going to last 2,000 years. There really was a sense that we're not going to need any of this. And now, once we start to see the early martyrdom of some of the key important players...
That's the other reason they had eyewitnesses. Why do I need to read about it? I can talk to Peter, I can talk to Paul, I can talk to Mark, I can talk to John. Well, that's certainly the point. Need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll take a phone call or two, 1-800-351-1212. Talking today about this wonderful book that I think you're going to want to have and use to teach from, Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. As I said before, about 280 pages, and it is published by David C. Cook. And you can find out more about it on our website, pointofview.net. You can also watch a video that gives you a little bit of an overview of what is in the book. All of it available on our website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, to go to the Point of View store, and maybe even get a podcast of this and share it with others. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jim Warner Wallace with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Cold Case Christianity. One more, at least wanted to put on the table, and that is the idea of corroboration. And that is, do you have facts in your testimony, in this case, the biblical testimony, that are corroborated by other eyewitnesses, so that would be internal evidence, or corroborated by external evidence in terms of history or archaeology? And that chapter, I thought, was outstanding, Jim. If for no other reason than I have been kind of working in that area, sometimes speaking on biblical reliability, sometimes speaking about supposed contradictions in the Bible, so-called Bible difficulties. Right. And you point out, first of all, in some of the sidebars there are all sorts of things I'd never even seen before, some unintentional support, undesigned coincidences in the gospel eyewitness accounts. And those are things that you look for as a detective, because if eyewitness A and eyewitness B say something, they've never talked to each other, but they both corroborate one another, that increases your reliability, your trustworthiness of their particular eyewitness accounts.
Yes, when you see puzzles fit together, puzzle pieces fit together, you understand that shape that's missing in one puzzle piece is the exact same shape that's available in the other one. That's how you see pieces come together, and it gives you great confidence you have the right two pieces are being linked. And when we see this in eyewitness testimony all the time, somebody will say something that leaves out some important gaps, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm not sure I understand what he's talking about here. The next person comes along and fills in the gaps unintentionally, the first person left out, and maybe answers a question. Of course, his testimony also raises questions that are answered by somebody else. And when you see this happening over and over again, well, this is just the nature, the flavor of real eyewitness accounts. They do this all the time. I've experienced this in much of my casework. And these also exist in the gospel accounts. This guy named J.J. Blunt in the 19th century wrote a little bit about this, and I started to see it even before I ever heard of J.J. Blunt. He called them the undesigned coincidences. I just looked at it as unintentional eyewitness support. It's a feature of true eyewitness accounts.
But again, there are all sorts of examples when you look at the different Gospels. People sometimes emphasize the differences in the Gospels, and I think you can respond to and resolve those. But what you are pointing out here, and again, I would encourage people to read chapter 12 of your book, are all sorts of places where maybe sort of a question surfaces in Matthew that's answered in John, a question surfaces in Mark that's answered in John, or a question is maybe asked in Matthew that's answered in Luke or the book of Acts. You pull that together, it really gives you a much clearer picture of the gospel and resolves some of the kind of questions that people might have of, well, I wonder why the disciples did that.
Yeah, we can't be lazy about this. A lot of times we'll just read over the accounts and we won't even see the things that should be standing out to us and forcing us to answer another question, or at least dig a little deeper. And detectives are pretty good about doing that. We look at every little word that's being used and we ask ourselves, of all the words he could have used in this sentence in responding to this question we asked him, isn't it interesting that he chose that word? And so we're doing the same thing with the Gospels. We're asking ourselves, hey, why say it this way? And if you start looking deeply at the use of language, you start to see things like we were talking about, this unintentional support. So I try to give a flavor of that in that chapter to help people see, well, what's the principle that detectives use, and then how could we use that principle in examining the Gospels?
One other one that you add there is corroboration of language. We've talked before about corroboration of archaeology, how things written in, especially let's look at Luke. He was one that was perhaps the most criticized in the 19th and maybe even the early part of the 20th century. Now we found archaeological discoveries that have validated the historical accuracy of Luke. But there's another part to this, and you point out that if you go and look at the various names that were used in Palestinian literature or in New Testament literature, for example, and then compare that to the names used in the Gospels, you find an interesting correlation. It looks very much like they were recording real events, real people's names. They weren't making up names. They weren't guessing, but it was actually corroborated.
Yeah, and Richard Bauckham has done the greatest work on this. But even for me, in looking at cold cases, if someone tells me, for example, they were a witness to a murder in 1979, and they mention a particular Fleetwood Mac album, let's say, the person they saw committing the crime was wearing a certain T-shirt that had a certain Fleetwood Mac logo on it. Well, I could at least know to myself, well, was Fleetwood Mac a big band back then? Was that album actually released? Was that tour actually going on at that time? And I can say, to ask myself, is that statement consistent with what I know about the culture in 1979, so that at least resonates? And this is what we see in the language used in the Gospels. Are the names they are selecting appropriate for that region of the world at that time in history, and are they unique to that time of history and that location in the world? That would at least give us confidence. Another piece. Now remember, any kind of corroboratory evidence is not going to give you 100% corroboration. If you told me this guy leaned over the counter and he pointed at the victim, and I go back and I find his fingerprint at the counter, that would be corroborative evidence, but it's only going to give me one little thing. He put his finger on the counter. It's not going to tell me anything about the rest of his actions. So remember, the kind of evidence we're looking for is only going to give you a touch point, a single piece of the larger narrative. But that's all we're looking for, are little touch points, and there are certainly more than enough of those in the kind of evidence we use to corroborate the Gospels.
Let me just, before I let you go, talk about in the appendix there, you have witnesses and resources. You have a section called Case Files, Expert Witnesses, and those are particular books that would be of help. Case files with assisting officers, key individuals, and then case files with case notes, some of the endnotes as well. But this is just a delightful book. I think a lot of our listeners will really enjoy reading it, and I would certainly recommend to those who would like to maybe teach apologetics, teach the defense of the gospel in a way that would be very engaging in light of all the television programs and even movies that are out right now that look at investigative evidence. This is a way in which you have taken your expertise and applied it to the gospel and brought a lot of new material to the conversation as well. So, Jim, it's just been a delight to have you on the program today.
Well, Kerby, I'm a big fan of yours. We have a mutual friend in Sean McDowell, so I've been looking forward to this conversation with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
I might mention in the special thanks, you talk about how Sean Sean McDowell really motivated you to write the book. Craig Hazen, who's been on the program with us as well, been very enthusiastic. And, of course, you can't do any better than having Lee Strobel write the foreword for the book. So you've certainly pulled together a number of individuals, as well as great endorsements from people like Rick Warren and Josh McDowell and Greg Kokel, Mark Middleton, all of who've been on the program with us before, as long as with J.P. Moreland and Sean McDowell and Paul Copan and many others that we've had on the program. And love to do it again, but I think it's a great book. It's just been out a short time, and I would encourage everyone to look for it in their local bookstore. If not, you can go to the website there, which is listed under the web links, Cold Case Christianity. And, of course, we have a Point of View store for you as well. So, Jim, thanks for joining us. Let's do it again.
Thanks, Kerby. I'll be happy to come back anytime you want.
Well, we'll do that.